Okay, sometimes we all wonder why some isekai anime follow the same formula and generic world building, and why there's always RPG elements, mana, goblins, slimes, and etc. Sometimes we also wonder why the excessive fan service or poorly handled social issues like slavery or raising a female slave you bought so you can date her when she comes of age. And why even when some of these animes try to do things differently, they don't truly add anything worthy of noting to the status quo. And while I'm by no means an isekai expert or connoisseur, this is just my 2 cents on why they exist, and how they might have become so popular within their target audience. But first we have to figure out who is isekai anime for, and what kind of target audience helps shape the mass production of animes like these. So when I looked it up and went deeper, it's actually quite apparent that there's a very specific demographic here. The audience who do consume isekai anime at higher rates is mainly Japanese men, some of which may feel disillusioned with their real lives and seek escapism through these kinds of stories. I kind of understand it, honestly. I can't imagine a burnt-out Japanese salaryman or some burnt-out kid who's a minor inconvenience away from ending it all would prefer to watch anything that resembled too much like real modern-day life. It might be partially the reason why there's been so much recent backlash against this anime called Chainsmoker Cat, especially by Japanese audiences. But that's a video for another time. If I don't feel like it, of course. Now that we've kind of figured out who the anime is made for, we gotta talk about the tropes themselves. In many isekai anime, characters possess status windows, levels, and skills like we usually see in video games. Guilds also tend to exist within these stories, with ranking systems to emphasize the MC's status and reputation. Cause, let's be real, who's gonna be scared of a C-rank adventure? Come on, man. Not to mention, these worlds that are usually in a medieval fantasy setting oftentimes include races we are already familiar with, like orcs, elves, dwarves, all that. And the monsters that often roam these worlds normally act as a way for these protagonists to progress and upgrade themselves by slaying them, or cooking them, depending. And these systems provide a great way to measure the growth of the protagonist, but usually in a more power scaling sense and not necessarily character development wise. The gaming concept that's oftentimes used in these stories make it easier to follow the character's development because there's a more tangible and visual indicator of how powerful your MC is now in comparison to before, whereas character development is harder to pinpoint in comparison. However, there are also tropes that touch on more complicated topics like the existence of slavery and the creepy and honestly uncomfortable treatment of women in these kinds of stories. I've actually talked about this in a previous video regarding Otomi Isekai manhwa, but there's a similarity in which slavery is sometimes used to develop cast members but is more or less only done for the protagonist's personal goals. It's something that doesn't really sit well with me, especially when these slave characters are also rounded up as part of the MC's harem or list of love interests. But does it compare to the weirdness of some of these MCs buying slaves to raise them and choosing to date them once they come of age? I don't know. Does it also compare to how some of these slaves are also written in ways where they're depicted to be thankful and happy that they're the protagonist's slave? I don't know either. That's for the viewer to decide, not me. But as much as I don't agree with how these stories treat certain demographics of characters, I'm not exactly here to judge or police anyone on what they watch. I used to literally watch these same animes as a little girl, and I didn't really process how wrong it was until like almost a decade later. Hell, I used to crush on Naofumi from The Rise of the Shield Hero. Not exactly the most proud of that, but anyway. But now we do have to ask why the generic world building, and why the recycling of the same old tropes that ultimately don't do anything for the story or overall themes. Why is there such a consistent fan base for this kind of content to the point where animation companies will keep churning out these stories simply because they still perform? Familiarity might be part of the reason why people keep coming back to it, and that familiarity makes it so much easier to consume. Because think about it, when you watch another generic isekai anime, you normally already have a baseline understanding about how the world works and what to expect. And when you compare that with Japan or Asia's notoriously demanding work culture, you can kind of see why these escapist fantasy stories are so popular. Because when you spend your life playing by others' rules, you usually just want to come home, turn your brain off for a little while, and watch something familiar, like some dude getting reincarnated into a fantasy world, with a harem and cheat skills where you already understand what's going on and what to expect, and you know that at least the story is gonna give you the kind of comfort and familiarity you're already used to. The viewer then doesn't have to wonder how the world actually works because they already know. And that means the isekai story can quickly give the viewer what they're here for. The overpowered protagonist, the elves, the fantasy essentially. And in a way, it's a little like fast food but for anime. However, is this an excuse for how certain topics like slavery and misogyny is handled? No, just because it's familiar doesn't mean I think writers should still perpetrate these things so carelessly. This is more of an explanation of why these things might be used in some of these stories. And obviously some shows do try to spice things up. They'll give the protagonist a weird ability, flip one of the usual tropes around, or throw in some gimmick that sounds completely different on paper. Like, we have animes that do all kinds of bullshit. Like that one anime where you get reincarnated as a vending machine. Like shit. Fair enough, man. But even with the really funky and interesting gimmicks, these stories still don't really deviate from the normal progression structure, nor do they have anything actually interesting to say about the characters, worlds, or literally anything at all, which is a shame considering some of these premises can be really interesting at times. The protagonist at most times is still absurdly overpowered. You still see the same fantasy races, the same guilds, the same medieval setting, power rankings, divine blessings, and maybe even the same harem setup just in different clothing. The gimmick is different, but the underlying fantasy hasn't really changed. And maybe that's why its performance has always been so consistent amongst viewers and people who do consume it. But even if certain parts of these audiences prefer the safer, more familiar version of isekai, there is still audiences who want more. Because even though some isekai shows may have decent passive views, these shows ultimately leave no real cultural footprint in the grand scheme of things. These kinds of animes are always being churned out every season, and eventually they're bound to be forgotten because there is no lasting consumer base to suggest continuous interest in the material itself. And considering the way that trends come and go way faster than they used to, people are always looking for new media to find, something new to latch onto, and that makes holding onto an audience much harder, almost like trying to hold water in your hands. And maybe that's the kind of foundation that is needed for audiences to want more high quality, more interesting stories to be made. Like stories like Dungeon Meshi, Witch Hat Atelier, stories that take place in more medieval fantasy settings but do change things around in a really refreshing way that it cultivates fandoms, engagement, and actual love for these stories. And to companies, this obviously translates to more merch sales and higher viewership because there's genuine hype and excitement around it. And that can't be as easily replicated by a typical isekai anime. And to me, that might be a good thing as it incentivizes these companies to actually take a better look at what they're making and adjust accordingly. Because at the end of the day, publishers and studios aren't just looking at whether something can technically sell, they're also looking at whether there's a market for it. So if people want more interesting stories, people are gonna have to show that there's a real market for it. Like how companies are actually taking notice that there's a market for otomi isekai manhwa catered to women, and so more and more manhwas are being adapted into anime in comparison to before. But even though these cliches exist, they're still not all inherently bad. Companies still greenlight stories like these because they already use formulas that are familiar, easy to understand, comforting, and most importantly, already have an audience. Isekai is a popular escapist fantasy genre, and if anything, that's something people want more than ever considering the state of the world right now. It's not that authors can't write, but it's more so that the industry knows that this familiarity is really easy to sell. And it's especially easy to sell to a tired audience that wants something familiar that they can get into more easily. So that's essentially my 2 cents on the topic, and I hope you enjoyed the video and what I had to say about isekai anime. Honestly, there are good isekai stories out there, and part of me wishes they were better in terms of writing most times, but that's not for me to say. I'm at least glad companies are pushing out more anime with higher quality and some with genuinely good writing, but it's actually thanks to the people contributing to the fandoms and actually engaging with this media that we have some of these amazing stories that we do today. And if you like what I had to say and would like to see me talk more about topics like these, feel free to drop a like and subscribe to see more of what I have in store. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a nice day. Bye bye!